Welcome, I'm Bruce Munro, and with me is International Relations Specialist Professor Robert Patman, and this is Global Insight. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, the largest land war in Europe since World War II, continues to dominate headlines around the globe. Welcome, Robert.
Morning, Bruce.
2 weeks in, is Putin's invasion succeeding?
It does not appear to be so. I think the invasion seems to be based on the strategy, at least initially, of blitzkrieg. That's a quick, rapid overrunning of the country. And I think Mr. Putin and his inner circle miscalculated the resilience and determination of the Ukrainian army, which has been considerably strengthened since 2014.
So he got that wrong on Ukraine. What other miscalculations did he make? The West, his own country.
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? It seems to me that Mr. Putin's got quite a lot wrong. He and his inner circle for some time have been saying that the West is failing and its inevitable decline. And this sort of misjudgment is sort of parallel to the sort of misjudgments that the old Soviet regime made at the end of the 70s when the United States lost the Vietnam War. On this occasion, this miscalculation, the conviction that the West was failing and would be unable to respond seemed to be based on several factors. First of all, the fact that Biden had withdrawn American troops from Afghanistan, acknowledged that America had not been winning there for 18 years. Secondly, I think Mr. Putin was confident because he's been actively supporting far-right forces in Western politics for some time. We saw Brexit, which the former Russian ambassador to London said brought the UK to its knees, which was the withdrawal of the UK from the EU and the weakening of the Western stance, so to speak. And also, I think Mr. Putin was quite pleased by supporting Mr. Trump for the first term and seeing a huge divisions, eventual storming of the Capitol in January last year. So I think, on balance, Mr. Putin seems to have bought into this idea that he could carry this operation out. There would be ritual protests and maybe a few sanctions, but nothing too drastic coming his way from the West, whereas we know, of course, it's unified the EU, NATO, the United States and the whole of Europe. And the thing that must be really alarming is he's not just got Western Europe and the United States against him, he's got the whole of Eastern Europe against him. And so it seems to be a huge strategic miscalculation. And he was warned, by the way, by military critics of the Putin regime before the invasion. I think what you recall from a previous conversation, there were dissident voices within the military establishment within Russia saying to Mr. Putin, look, if you're silly enough or unwise enough to invade Ukraine, this will not be a tea party. And another commentator said it'll be a catastrophe. Well, that seems to be how it's panning out.
It looks like the US and NATO will do anything within its power to avoid this war escalating beyond the borders of Ukraine. So what is the West's strategy in this? What is it aiming for now?
I think the strategy is to give the Ukraine as much support and assistance as it can, military assistance. There's talk about transferring MiG-29 planes from Poland. That was on and off, but I think something will eventuate soon. There's many countries, including countries which have previously been non-aligned, countries like Sweden, for example, are transferring weaponry to the Ukrainian government. They're getting a lot of equipment. So I think the strategy, if there is such a thing, I think the response, which is probably a better word, of the West in opposing Mr. Putin is to isolate the regime diplomatically and economically, which they've succeeded in doing through a combination of sanctions and diplomatic pressure, and in addition to fortify the Ukrainian resistance. Of course, in the meantime, this is taking a terrible toll on Ukraine. We're witnessing an unprecedented slaughter. It's estimated, according to some Russian unofficial sources, that the Russian army may have lost us up to 10,000. Well, some intelligence agencies place it between 2,000 and 4,000 in the first week's fighting. Another one from Russia put it as high as 10,000. We don't know the precise figure. The Kremlin's only admitted to losing 500 in the first week, but even that is a very high number of deaths, and there'll be a lot of very grief-stricken families in Russia. So Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that from Mr. Putin's point of view, things are not turning out as planned. He says it's all going according to plan, but I think the Ukrainians seem to be utterly determined. And you know what, Bruce, there's another point to note here. It's not just a military disaster for Mr. Putin, it's a political disaster, because even if he advances on Kiev and overthrows the regime, and that's still possible given, you know, the military preponderance that Russia has, he will not be able to establish a pro-Putin regime that's accepted by the Ukrainians. They've made that quite clear. So what he's facing up to, even if he militarily overruns the country, he will face a full-blown insurgency. And the Russian economy can't sustain this sort of thing. It was already struggling before they entered Ukraine. So it's looking, I think, quite grim for Mr. Putin, and of course the speculation that he may be challenged domestically.
Right, and I'd like to ask about that, because could it be that the West has thought, let's flip what's going on here? Russia is trying to invade Ukraine, trying to achieve certain things. Let's use this as an opportunity to try and get rid of Putin. How important is the sanctions on the oligarchs, on Putin's ultra-rich friends? How important is that in the West's thinking here?
Well, I think for many people in the West, they assume that Putin is somewhat beholden to the oligarchs, and I'm not sure that's really the case. The oligarchs, these are exceptionally wealthy business people who basically have disproportionate influence in a society which power is concentrated in very few hands. There was a deal whereby if they agreed to keep out of politics and also, I think, looked after the regime, they would be fine. And of course, Mr. Putin has, according to the US Treasury, become fabulously wealthy in the last 22 years. An estimate in 2016 said that he had more in excess of about $70 billion. Well, he didn't make that on his regular salary in the presidency. Will the oligarchs stage a rebellion? It's difficult to know. I don't think, you see, Mr. Putin has already severely punished oligarchs who stepped out of line. So he does seem to have the whip hand, but his position is weakening. And the oligarchs, of course, are seeing many of their fortunes are just evaporating, because the interesting thing about these 500 so oligarchs that have about 40% of Russia's wealth is that many of them have foreign connections. Many of them have relocated to London or New York or other parts of the Western world. And so, and the other interesting thing is that children of oligarchs, some of whom are at Oxford University and Harvard, are speaking out against Mr. Putin. So this is an interesting situation. It's all a bit unpredictable. I still think many of the oligarchs are wary of moving against or even supporting a movement against Mr. Putin because he's utterly ruthless. You know, people have been saying, after seeing these appalling scenes on TV where civilians have been targeted, you know, he must have lost his mind. But actually, he's been engaging in violence for a long time as leader. His behaviour during the Chechen civil war, where he flattened Grozny, his willingness to use, his willingness to authorise his military to use indiscriminate missile attacks in Syria, and now he has, you know, his opponents have often ended up dead in Russia. So he does have a track record in this area. He's a cold, calculating politician. And I think he's seeking to just grind Ukraine down as quickly as he can, because he knows he's in a race against time here, because those sanctions, particularly the sanctions of severing Russia's participation in the international payments transfer system known as SWIFT, it really will start biting very shortly. And many Russian, and we've seen a huge exodus of companies, 290 companies have curtailed their activities, either left or stopped doing business in Russia. Companies like McDonald's, and financial companies such as Visa, MasterCard, all these things will affect everyday Russians. And lots of Russians are trying to leave the country now.
I want to ask you briefly about New Zealand government's Russia Sanctions bill that's just gone through Parliament. It allows the country to introduce sanctions against Russia independent of any decisions made by the United Nations. I think you were against this idea. Why do you think the New Zealand government has gone ahead with it?
Well, that was before I heard, I think when we had that conversation, I had underestimated the degree of influence that permanent members of the Security Council have. So when the Security Council did pass a resolution to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Russia duly vetoed it. Now, the General Assembly stepped up and passed a measure condemning it. But I think that brought home that while we'd like to see the UN work better, it can't at the moment. It's dysfunctional. And, I think the New Zealand government has pragmatically accepted that while it would like to work through the UN, I think many Kiwis would like to work through the UN, we're a multilateral player, it's just not possible. And at the same time, we have to do everything as possible. As we said before, we've got skin in this particular game. We have to do everything possible to communicate with the Russian people and indicate that their leader acting in their name is acting in a totally unacceptable fashion and must be stopped. And so therefore, that's why I think we've gone for that, if you like, dedicated sanctions bill, the Russia sanctions bill. I don't think the government had a lot of choice. I've certainly moved in my own assessment because I thought that, that there would have been, that Russia would have been more apologetic and defensive in the UN Security Council, but it didn't prove to be. And what I do think is that New Zealand and middle powers must push for getting this veto removed, because at the moment the UN is basically a bystander in what is a global conflict.
So New Zealand's taking this independent stance and it's following the lead of others doing the same. Is this the beginning of the end of the United Nations?
I don't think so. I think it's probably the beginning of the end of the United Nations in its existing form. But boy, it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of courage to change what is a 1945 model of an international organisation, where you've got 5 powers which have a privilege, the veto power. That's the United States, Russia and China, France and UK. They can block anything they don't like, which means that some of the worst situations in the world are receiving no attention at all because it comes into conflict with some of the interests of the permanent members. So that absurdity has got to be dealt with. And I think we've got to stop tiptoeing around the issue. The Russia conflict, and indeed the US illegal invasion of Iraq. This is Russia's invasion of Ukraine is illegal, but the US invasion of Iraq was illegal in 2003, and in a sense provided a precedent, an example, which Russia has capitalized on, unfortunately. We have to actually do something about reform the UN Security Council so it's more functional and can act in a more authoritative fashion in situations where there's desperate human suffering.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. Catch us next time on Global Insight. Noho ora mai.